In today's episode, I sit down with Professor Christopher Gardner to chat about his recent twin study and the Netflix documentary, You Are What You Eat.
Everybody knows the average American diet is not very healthy. We sometimes call it SAD for sad.
When you remove genetics as a variable, is there a significant benefit to adopting a healthy omnivorous or healthy vegan diet?
A lot of the things in the diets were the same. So we just had a simple principle, which was we delivered the same number of calories, but they ate different amounts.
You want efficacy or effectiveness?
You can film on campus, but be very careful. This is a Gardner study. This isn't a Stanford study. So what if we got people who are genetically the same?
This is a study and documentary that's received a lot of media, including some pretty scathing reviews from people like Dr. Peter Attia, Nina Teicholz, and Dr. Mark Hyman.
There's almost like there's a target on your back. Oh my God, what century are you living in?
So I just want to give a formal
I'm not trying to make the world vegan. I just want people to appreciate a lot more plants.
In this episode, you will learn about the study itself and hear me discuss these critiques with the senior author of the study. Please enjoy.
And I should respond to that.
Yeah.
You ready? I'm not trying to make the world vegan. Go.
Professor Christopher Gardner, thank you so much for making the trip down to LA today.
Pleasure to be here in person. More fun in person.
Another day and another Christopher Gardner RCT, randomized controlled trial that ends up, I guess we could say, being gobbled up by the media, social media alike. A lot of positive reviews, some not so positive critiques, things that I hope we can kind of unpack today. Were you ready for or surprised by the kind of overwhelming response that came after you published this study and after the documentary on Netflix was released?
Yeah, and timing is everything here. So I'll start out to say that when we started filming this and doing the study at the same time, it was kind of odd. We were dealing with things like Stanford, very protective of their brand. Wanted to make sure that there was nothing over my shoulder that said Stanford. They said, you can film on campus, but be very careful. This is a Gardner study. This isn't a Stanford study. And the discussion started in 2021. We got the money in the start of 2022. We ran the study in winter and spring of there. And then we analyzed blood and poop for the rest of 2022. And at one point, the producer, Luis Cejoyo, said, oh yeah, we're going to release this on January 1st. And I kind of thought it was January 1st, 2023. And then I had the realization that they then wanted all the film for a year to edit. And it didn't release for another year. And I almost forgot about it in that time because it had been so long. And we were very much working on the publication.
Did you have to delay the publication?
No, not at all. No. So inside scoop, Stanford said when we started, said, is this legit? Is this like a publishable trial? And in real life, you can't know what's going to happen. If you didn't run the study yet, you didn't submit it. So I BS'd and I said, of course this is, because I knew at some level I could submit it to a predatory journal if I had to at the last minute.
What's a predatory journal?
Well, you have to pay a lot of money and they don't really review it very well and they publish anything. Very discouraging how much of that there is out there.
That doesn't seem like the path that an esteemed scientist would take.
But I had to give them this answer, like they wouldn't let them on campus to film unless I promised it would be published. Mm-hmm. And for those who don't understand this world, it doesn't work that way. What if nobody signed up and nobody came to the study? And so this is before doing anything. But all of my work has been published in 30 years. So we said yes. And to be honest, it's not rocket science design. It's pretty standard design for me. Probably not the best study I ever did. But we submitted it to JAMA Network Open.
Which is not a predatory journal.
Very high-end journal. I kind of thought, we'll get some good feedback. And then if they reject it, we'll go here. And they took it. And back and forth always takes longer than you think. Ends up being published on November 30th, a month before Netflix comes out. Planned? Not at all planned. Just sort of serendipity that it comes out. Survives on its own. Actually had a huge altmetric score. Do your listeners know what an altmetric score is?
Let's unpack
Do you
it.
know what an altmetric score is?
Let's unpack it.
So for me as a faculty member, my currency is what other scientists cite my work. And that takes years. So if you look at some of my best work, you don't really know till 5 years out to see how many people cited it. An altmetric score is more of a traditional and social media score. So it's tracking how often it's in the WAPO, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, as well as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all those things.
Or
and
X, we should call it.
I don't call it X. I call it Twitter. I refuse. And so, instantly, within a month what this altmetric score is. And the altmetric score went through the roof. It's over 2,000 right now. 20 is considered a good score. So it took off. But this is just the journal article. So for a month, got a lot of love for that. I got a little pushback on some of the design features, which always happens. In fact, hope we get to it. But I had a great tutorial.
Yeah, we'll get into that because I think I've shared some blogs from folks like Peter Attia that have commented on the design. I want to unpack that.
But the design before the film came out, so it was sort of like this huge mass media thing for a month, and it was just tapering down, and then Netflix came out, and then it just bumped over the moon. I was surprised.
Why do you think that was the response? Is it because it just played nicely into the diet tribe conversation?
So I got somebody forwarded me a tweet from an investigator. I can't remember where she was before, but she's at Harvard now. And she was partly responsible for releasing the Moderna vaccine. And she released this really nice tweet saying, "This is some of the best science communication I have ever seen." And the reason it was so good is because viewers didn't understand that they were getting science communication. It was entertaining and engaging. And she went on in a mini little tutorial to suggest that she wished they had done something like that for the vaccine. There was a lot of misunderstanding, and if they had just communicated that in a more engaging way, that would have worked. And that's what Louis did. He took this science and he made it very engaging and fun. It was number 3 on Netflix for 2 weeks. And it was at its basis science, but he put so much more into it to make it accessible to people.
And so in reflection, do you feel like on the aggregate, on the net, the response has been largely positive and the negative sort of critiques are few and far between, but maybe from some individuals that people would say are quite influential in this space?
Yeah, there's some definite influencers that critiqued it, but the overwhelming positive response I got makes those negative critiques a rounding error to me. I got love from all over the world for months. Friends, neighbors, family, complete strangers who were impacted by that Netflix. That is the most impactful thing I have ever done in my career in a positive way.
Wow. That must feel pretty good.
It feels really good.
I have this kind of conflicted position here. So if I speak to an academic about this study, most of the time the conversation is very similar. They understand the study, what it shows, maybe what it doesn't show, how to interpret it, how not to overinterpret it, and it doesn't seem that controversial. But then if I speak to a friend that doesn't have a science background, they feel a little confused. Mm-hmm. And I kind of, to a degree, I can empathize with them. So I want to read out a couple of things to illustrate this. So this is a blog. This is on Netflix's blog, right? Okay. They did a blog, and I appreciate the documentary is separate to the study, right? Let's clarify that.
Agreed.
Yeah. There's a quote here that says, "The study found that after only 8 weeks, the twins eating the plant-based diet experienced an increase in their life expectancy, reduced visceral fat, the dangerous fat that accumulates around your organs, reduced risk of heart disease, and even a heightened sexual drive. The results surprised even the Stanford research team." So that's on Netflix's blog. Is all of that accurate?
I never heard that blog, but you'd have to deep dive into those results to see what that was. I'm sort of hanging my head over the sexual drive thing. It's ridiculous. The body fat thing, I hope we get into that. It's not even part of the study. So that's an exaggeration of what we're, right. That's not, a lot of that isn't even part of the study.
What about increase in their life expectancy?
Yeah, that is super cool. Biological clock, epigenetics, super preliminary.
Okay.
Doesn't really show anything for certain.
So someone kind of reads that, and then they read this from Peter Attia on his blog, maybe even in the same day.
Ready.
And he says, perhaps this chaotic three-ring circus or a docuseries serves to highlight the nonsense of the study itself. And for those of us for whom health is our top dietary concern, this research, in quotation marks, should be taken for just what it is, entertainment, not rigorous science. So these are two distinctly different takes.
Yeah.
And so my understanding is that when people are exposed to these two different takes, they either do nothing or they say, in this case, I'm trusting Peter because he's a smart guy,
Yeah.
and documentaries are likely to be biased, kind of telling a story.
Fair. And I should respond to that.
Yeah,
You ready?
I'm ready. When you hear that, tell me how you feel.
Yep. So if you get this much of a viewership for something like that, there's almost like there's a target on your back for sure. And this is not trivial. This is ways of eating. Everyone eats. There's a lot of vested interest in this. It is a chance for an influencer to critique something and trash talk it, and I assume gain influence. But at its core, the study was a decent study. It wasn't the best study I've ever done. But I've been doing this for 30 years. And one of the challenges of it is science communication. So is this just going to be fellow scholars? Is this going to be physicians in change practice? Is this going to be the average person who views this? And all of those are really challenging to try to put into one study and one set of information. And at the end of the day, I'm kind of looking at the flip side of this is, how much health information has come from the cattlemen's industry and the egg and the poultry and the Frito-Lay and there's tons of messaging out there kind of in the opposite direction. And so just even dabbling in this and seeing what it would be like to move past the research conference and past the colleagues, this is absolutely fascinating and intriguing to think of this opportunity to reach more people. And sure, it will have some misunderstanding and some downsides, but it's been really exciting.
Right, so you were ready for some of this critique.
Oh, it had to be. It was like, if you're going to expose this science to so many people, and so many people think diet is contentious, and I want to thank you for what you've done with nutrition science. I think much like the episode I did that was pegged as a debate with Stu Phillips.
That was a fun episode.
It was a really fun episode. And I think what was fabulous was sort of having both people at the table at the same time. There had been a tweet at one point that looked controversial.
I think it was said at the top, a great debate.
Yeah. And as soon as we exchanged an email or two, it was like, we agree about almost everything. And there's a couple things we disagree upon. And it's obviously the contention and the disagreement is more exciting than just two people. Yeah, you should eat vegetables and you should exercise. Yeah, everybody agrees on that. That's pretty boring. Can we find something that they disagree on is more exciting? But my experience has been, so I've worked with the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association. I'm on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. When you get a bunch of scientists in the room and the data are in front of you, there's very little disagreement. We rarely have all the information to definitively and unequivocally say, this is the thing you should eat or avoid. That is rare. And so when you have inadequate evidence, you have to put together all the evidence you do have. It's not like you don't have any. You have a bunch. There's some animal model study. There's some observational epi. There's a Kevin Hall study that was really well controlled, but only for 20 people for 2 weeks. And you have a Gardner study that was 50 or 100 or 600 people for a couple of months or a year. If you put all that on the table, people are likely to be able to, scientists are likely to say, yeah, we all kind of agree that this is probably the thing and the strength of the evidence is this level and more studies are needed. It's so frustrating. At the end of almost every discussion, more studies are needed. But people have to eat today and tomorrow. So we make recommendations for today and tomorrow based on what we know.
Yeah, I think we may have touched on this in our last episode, that if you're on the outside, you might think that everyone just disagrees with one another. There's no consensus position. You may as well just eat however you like.
Yeah, that hurts.
That hurts.
Yeah. There's so much more consensus than that. It's ridiculous. If Peter, Attia, and I were at the same table, we would agree on almost everything, to be honest.
I know that you've collaborated with Peter before, I think, in Diet Fits. Is that right?
We did, and it was very frustrating that he didn't call me about some of his concerns. I worked with him for years.
Right. Yeah, I thought when I read that, given the history with Diet Fits, I wondered, like, do you take that feedback from someone like him personally when they say, the work you've just done, it's entertainment, it's not science?
Yeah, that hurt more than almost all the other critiques, just because it would have been so easy to pick up the phone and said, Christopher, I can't believe you did this thing. And if I had just had 1 minute, I would have said, you know what? I didn't do that thing. That was in the movie, not in the study. And that was a fallout. And I don't have control over the movie, but damn, that movie got a lot of attention. That was pretty fun, Peter.
Yeah, I was surprised he didn't have you on his show, but maybe he will. There's still time.
I'm open.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to come to Peter's main critique, which was about an kind of independent variable and some of the other critiques. But before we do that, let's actually bring people up to speed with what this study is, what we're actually talking about. You've kind of alluded to it, but what's the origin story behind this study? I know that Louis Sahoyas, he came to you with an idea.
He did, yeah. Wasn't even my idea. So he was looking for a follow-up to Game Changers. So that was vegan athletes. This is a very interesting angle to make a documentary about. And there are clearly some issues with Game Changers. And there's some really cool, irrefutable facts from Game Changers that are also pretty stunning and fun, but I won't go there. That's a different movie. So in trying to build on that was sort of a unique twist. He thought, wow, maybe we should look at the microbiome and we should use health, and we could do a study that was a thread underlying a new feature film. We'll bring in lots of different topics, but there is an amusing factor here. I hope this is going to make sense if I jump ahead and then jump back. So he wanted to do identical twins. I said, where's that coming from? Wow, I mean, that's kind of interesting. Recruitment is the hardest thing in any study. And constraining it to identical twins is like, that's madness.
Right, you're narrowing the pool.
Why would you do that? On the other hand, it's sort of, well, that's like one leg up in science and control. When we randomize people to different diets, and RCTs, randomized controlled trials, are better than observational epi for cause and effect along the causal inference pathway. That'd be like controlling for genetics. That would be like doing a crossover study without a crossover. When you do a crossover, you are your own control. But what if your twin is your control because they have the same genetics, same height, got raised the same way? So it sounded really interesting to do this. I'm going to leap ahead to being in the middle of the study. And one of the staff writes me and says, there may be a problem here. We've looked at YouTube, and there is a YouTube of identical twins going vegan, an omnivore. Somebody has done this. And so I quickly dial it up, and I look at it, and it's a pair of twins at a Tim Spector study, who has 1,000 twins in the UK. Tim Spector, who's part of Zoe. And they go on and on about this thing and the study. And so I get really nervous, and I call Tim Spector up, and I said, oh my God, dude, I never saw this study. Did you ever publish this? And he said, that's not a study. That was one pair of twins that went rogue, and they're influencers in the UK, and they made a little video about themselves doing this.
And they got some media coverage. I remember it popping up on my phone.
Yeah, it was pretty funny. So I was sort of terrified and then relieved, and I called Louis on the phone. I said, Louis, if you ever see this, I want to assure you, Tim Spector has told me this is not a study. So no one has scooped us on this. We will be the first to do a study out of this. And he said, dude, that's how I got the idea. I saw the video. I saw the video and then thought, wouldn't that be cool if somebody did a study? So isn't that kind of fun?
Yeah, shout out to those two guys for planting the seed.
Louis got the idea because that planted the seed. and he was looking for somebody who's really interested in the microbiome. And actually, he's interested in everything, but he thought it would be really fascinating to have a published study as the thread that held everything together. So he approached me, and I thought, and he was very specific about the vegan diet. So the twins that had done this, one was vegan and one was omnivore. So I'm very much a plant-based proponent. I'm pretty much vegan myself, but I'm not a proselytizing vegan. I'm all in for usually eggs, yogurt, fish. There's all kinds of healthy animal products.
You've unpacked that on the show before.
Yeah, I'm not really a hardcore vegan proselytizer. So this, but
and
vegan sounded...
a number of the, sorry to interrupt, but a number of the other authors or other scientists involved in this paper, they were not vegan, right?
Oh yeah, no. So my lab group isn't all vegan. We don't have like a rule. You can work in the Gardner lab if you are vegan, and otherwise, forget it.
I think that's an important point to kind of underscore, because some of the claims that I've seen, or people that are saying we shouldn't, trust the results from this study, have seemed to suggest that this is a vegan plant-based team of scientists who had some type of agenda.
The vegan mafia out to get you. No, we're really scientists. We're pretty objective, and we eat a wide range of things. I don't even know who is or isn't vegan or vegetarian in my group. Never comes up. I would never want them to feel uncomfortable. But fun study idea, thinking, yeah, so I've studied ketogenic, Mediterranean, low fat, low carb. This is my thing. So I actually love the challenge of coming up with not a single nutrient, not a single food, but a diet pattern. In fact, I was the writing chair of an American Heart Association scientific statement that just came out trying to provide an overview of different dietary patterns as they relate to heart disease. And it's really challenging. Dietary patterns are pretty vague, but well known. A lot of those names I just mentioned, plus paleo, plus low-fat vegan, plus pescatarian. A lot of people followed diets like that, but to do a study of it is much more challenging than just studying grams of fiber, grams of saturated fat, soy, or something like that. And I love that challenge.
Mm-hmm. Come back to the twin component.
Ready.
So let's just clarify why that is interesting or special. I was listening to Mark Hyman did a podcast on the study. And I've met Mark before, so just on the record, I think he's a nice guy. But I do sort of respectfully disagree with some of the things that were in that episode, which I'm sure will come up today. But on this idea of removing genetics as a variable, Mark said, and I'm quoting here, the twin component added very little value. You can control for genetics in ordinary randomized controlled trials. The twin element was kind of weird.
Yeah, so that's pretty odd. So I don't know anybody that can control for genetics in a randomized controlled trial. So there's a bazillion DNA nucleotides out there. There's hundreds of thousands of single nucleotide polymorphisms. I don't know how you can control for hundreds of thousands.
Maybe he was thinking of controlling for like one gene.
Possibly, yeah. But so far for most of the issues, now that we've unraveled the DNA, that never panned out the way people had hoped, that there would be one or two single nucleotide polymorphisms that explained a large proportion of some kind of health outcome. And for a few rare diseases, that is true. But for something in particular, excess weight, obesity, that's gone back and forth from 50 to 200 SNPs. And when you put them all together, it explains no more than 5% of differentials. And so, no, you can't control for that by just knowing everyone's DNA. So wrong.
Okay, coming back to the origin story, and I guess the study premise. So there was this cool idea to bring in identical twins and randomize them to different dietary patterns.
Yes.
Okay, so what did that look like?
So that looked like finding these twins, which, in fact, there was a little bit of a miscommunication. So when they approached us, they said, we promise it won't be hard. We found all the twins for you. When we called all the twins that they found, they didn't all want to play. Turned out Stanford had recently sort of inherited a twin registry. And so when we went to the Stanford twin registry, that's actually where we got most of them. And we had a budget set, and we could only really handle about 40 to 50 people total, or 20 to 25 pairs of identical twins. So I just wanted to say up front that I actually got a lot of love from colleagues thinking, oh my God, that was brilliant. Used identical twins. No one does that in nutrition studies. That sort of added an extra level of rigor. Personally, I recognized it as an entertainment opportunity. People are fascinated with twins. I didn't realize this when I was starting the study. I really looked at it from the scientific perspective. I think that the JAMA Network Open publication that came out got much more attention than it would have if it had not been identical twins. And I don't think the idea, now that we've gone back and looked at it, so hopefully you'll geek out on this, we did a lot of very appropriate statistical analyses, but at the end there's one that you could do just to see how big a difference the twins made. And you could do a matched pairs t-test, or you could do a 2-sample t-test. And what that means is, the matched pairs is what you do if it was only you at 2 time points and you'd be compared to yourself. That would be much tighter statistically than you compared to me. So in theory, if the twins made a big difference, then doing one that kept the twin into account versus just treating them as 2 random samples of people, you could see in this very simple statistical test how much of a difference it would make. It didn't really change any of the outcomes.
Oh, wow.
They all came out the same. I wouldn't have known this ahead of time. If you had asked me ahead of time, how much of a difference do you think it will make to match the twins?
So what's the significance of that?
The significance of it is that I don't think, like I won't in my next study intentionally look for identical twins because it will increase the statistical rigor of my study. It had maybe a modest effect in increasing the rigor. Probably not worth the extra trouble to recruit twins, and probably not worth people commenting saying, oh, this isn't generalizable. It's only generalizable to identical twins because that's who you recruited.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you have this idea of running this study.
Uh-huh.
We're going to look at identical twins. We're going to put them on different dietary patterns. One of those dietary patterns is a vegan diet.
Yes.
The other dietary pattern is an omnivorous diet. And just like you've done in previous studies, you're making sure that these are diets that are high quality.
And that's so important to me. So I feel like in our field, if you're comparing diet A to B, this so often, it's so easy to do this, is to say, I'm a huge fan of A, and so I'm going to make a crappy B, kind of to hedge my bets to make sure A wins. And that gets published in the media, and another study comes out the next day, and it's a proponent of B, and they make a really great B and kind of a crappy A. And the consumer looks at that, reads the headlines, say, wait, A one day and B the next. Wow, they never agree. So one way to eliminate some of that confusion is to make the healthiest A possible and the healthiest B possible, which we did. And I'm super proud of Diet Fits, our study, that we did low fat and low carb. It was very clearly, like, if both of them won, that would have been great. All the people on both diets would have lost a lot of weight. I'd be famous if there was no A-B difference, but everybody lost 50 pounds. They didn't all lose 50 pounds. They lost a range of 50 pounds to gaining 10 pounds in both studies, but I feel so comfortable. And so did the health educators, the dietitians that were working on it. And they were teaching people to eat the way that was proposed in the study. They felt, they slept really well at night. I told everybody to eat the best one of these and the best one of those. We did that with ketogenic and Mediterranean. I am not a ketogenic diet fan at all. But I said, we need to do the well-formulated ketogenic diet of Finney and Volek, and you need to sleep well, that you told these people the best possible way to eat a ketogenic diet. And so that's what we did again here.
Otherwise, when you publish it, people say, hang on, you compared a Mediterranean diet to a junk food keto diet with hyperpalatable foods.
And no surprise that the one you wanted won. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Boring.
Right. Setting up one arm of the study to lose.
Yeah. And so I don't know if you were going to ask this, but I want to bring it up. So how do you clarify an omnivore and a vegan diet? Because a lot of the things in the diets were the same. So we just had a simple principle, which was the omnivore diet would get 30% of its calorie from animal foods. And that would be a combination of eggs and yogurt and fish and poultry. And the vegan diet would get none of those. So both groups would get told to avoid added sugar and refined grain, both groups, because sometimes vegans eat a lot, drink Coke and have French fries and eat a lot of crappy stuff, right? So I also wanted to be a healthy vegan diet. So basically picture that the vegans and the omnivores were supposed to eat 70% of the same thing. You're supposed to get vegetables and whole grains and legumes and things like that. But of the 30% of calories that were going to be eggs and yogurt and chicken and fish, the vegans just ate more of the same thing. They just ate 30%, however you want to frame this, more vegetables, more beans, more. So that's how it was described. They were supposed to be similar in 70% of the diet, and the 30% that was supposed to be animal product calories was just more of the same, nothing different, just more of the same for the vegans. Now, do you think that's the perfect definition?
The perfect definition of...
See, this is how, there isn't one way to do this, right? So if we got a whole bunch of us around a room ahead of time, and I didn't, what if I got all my colleagues around the room and said, I'm going to run a study of omnivores versus vegan? We're all on board. There's only one way to do this, right? I think somebody might have said, what about 25% of the calories? What about 20% of the calories? What if the vegans intentionally eat more of this, not that? So there isn't one way to do this. And the important part is to describe how you did it. And so we did it. And right away, that is subject to criticism that, oh man, you picked the wrong vegan diet or you picked the wrong omnivorous diet. That's the challenge with patterns. So there isn't one way to do a pattern. And that my main concern is that you describe it well enough that somebody could replicate it. That's a huge part of science, is you're supposed to, in your method section, show that it's replicable. And that you publish the adherence to these. That's another thing that I'm super proud of that our group does. We spend a lot of effort looking at adherence. And so we actually are publishing a separate paper. It's just about to be submitted this week with table after table after table of all the nutrients and all the food differences at baseline, at 4 weeks after they've been fed by the delivery service, and at 8 weeks after they've been eating on their own. And we compare every nutrient and every food within and between the two groups.
We were chatting about some of that on email yesterday. And
It's a lot of data.
Just generally, though, across the board, it looked to me like from baseline, both groups, their diet quality improved. Or at least most people looking at the changes in nutrient intake would say that on the whole, they shifted in the right direction.
And yeah, and you would expect that given our premise. And we have a really great graphic that's going to go with this new paper. So there's an overall metric for diet quality that's used quite often in science called the HEI, the Healthy Eating Index. It's based on, I can't remember, 12 or 15 components. And you get positive points if you reverse, like if you don't get added sugar, you get positive points. If you get vegetables, you get positive points. So some are reverse coded, some are just directly coded. You add it all up, you get a score of 0 to 100. The average American for the last couple decades has scored about a 60 out of 100, which is a little embarrassing. Like there was a lot of room for improvement. So in the main graphic that will go with this, it'll show that both sets of twins, no matter what they were assigned to, were eating just a little below 60.
At baseline.
Yeah, so that's like the average American diet. And they both got over 70 while Trifecta was feeding them delivered meals. And there was some recidivism when they were on their own. That dropped a little. But both of them were consuming a diet, both on average, that was significantly higher in the HEI score at 4 and 8 weeks than it was before. So both omnivores and vegans were eating more healthfully throughout the study.
That's a really important point.
Thank you.
And we actually haven't yet clarified this. So this was an 8-week study. You're providing food, or almost all of the food, for the first 4 weeks through Trifecta. They're making their own snacks, I think.
Yeah.
And then the last 4 weeks, they're buying, preparing, cooking their own food, but still trying to adhere as best as possible to the guidelines that your dietitians have given them.
Yeah. And can I throw in 2 words, efficacy and effectiveness? So efficacy would be a Kevin Hall study where you're like cooking all the food for them and domiciling them so that they can't leave, and you're handing it to them and you're collecting all the waste, and per protocol is another scientific word for this. They're eating just what you wanted them to eat.
So you're not only controlling the nutrients that they're eating, the types of food, but also the amount, the amount of energy, number of calories.
Yeah, matching everything. And that's great for scientific rigor, but it has limitations for generalizability, because what if one is more filling than the other? You can't know that. So the other way is to have them just eat on their own. If they're just eating on their own and it's quite new, like a vegan diet was quite new for most of these people, it would have taken them a long time. Quite a few of them started the study thinking, vegan? Oh my God, I'm going to eat rice and beans for 4 weeks or 8 weeks. That's it? No. Oh, we had all kinds of dishes. So trifecta for 4 weeks, made them like 50, 60 different dishes that rotated through. And they said, a vegan diet can be all these things. I'm pretty unfamiliar with those, but okay. Now I have a better idea. So the first half of 4 weeks was sort of efficacy. This is more along the lines of what it would be if we could control them. Now I wasn't at their home making sure they ate it, and then there's 4 weeks afterward where they're cooking on their own after they learned that. So it's kind of an efficacy and an effectiveness component of the trial. Yes.
I know that you measured diet satisfaction. Did that change between the first 4 weeks and the last 4 weeks? I think I was looking at the kind of, questionnaire or the elements that went into that diet satisfaction score. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think at least my interpretation of that, and it kind of makes sense with my lived experience and speaking to people that changed to a vegan diet, was that, baseline all of these subjects, I'm assuming they were omnivores, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the twins is randomized to an omnivorous diet, be it a little different. It's probably
pretty similar
to what they've been eating and had self-selected. So then the other twin is now randomized to a diet that they didn't self-select. It's different to their baseline diet. And so I think it would be expected that satisfaction, at least initially in the first 8 weeks of something, might be lower because eating out could be a little more difficult, because buying, preparing, and cooking new foods is a little more challenging. Would that be fair to say?
Fair to say. And the satisfaction score was on a scale of 0 to 5. And both of them said they liked their baseline diet on an average of 3.5. And then the omnivores sort of stayed at 3.5. And the vegans went down to 3.0. And interestingly, there aren't any statistics involved there. So there's no statistical test. We didn't actually test everything under the sun. But we probably should go back and look at that. I'll bet it's not statistically significant. But it is, I think, for somebody to fully accommodate a vegan diet, they would have to go longer than 8 weeks to appreciate all that.
Some of the takes that I've seen, and we're kind of jumping ahead, but we'll come back, I promise, to make sure we summarize like what you were interested in measuring and the outcomes and all of this and your hypotheses. But the vegans in the study did eat less calories, a little bit less calories. And I've seen people say, look at the diet satisfaction. It's clear that this group probably didn't enjoy the taste of these meals, and so they ate less. But that's an assumption, right?
Yep, that's an assumption. And that there's a lot of different angles in there. So they reported slightly lower satisfaction, but I don't know if it's statistically significant. It was really fun, actually. So when we did randomize them, we called it the big reveal. And there were some who were actually kind of anxious to try a vegan diet, and there were some who were dreading it. There's actually a point in the Netflix show where I'm getting ready to randomize some of them, and I actually do this in all my studies. Say, you signed up for this. You are going to get randomized. Think of which diet you want the least. Assume you're going to get it, and that your luck sucks, because if you get that one, you still have to stay with the study. And if you're not willing to do that, please don't join, because we need whoever signs up for this study to be willing to do either one and wait to see how it goes. Clearly, there's some people who did it and didn't want to. There's another quote that I've been sort of critiqued on, and I think some people took this the wrong way. 21 out of 22 pairs of twins finished the study, and adherence was really high. This is an internal validity point that I don't think many people recognize. So I think somebody misquoted me as saying, oh, just because they finished the study, he assumed they loved it. So I think they just were stoic and put up with it. I think both of those are wrong. So we said, you really need to stick with this. It's part of the study. If you quit, it diminishes the internal validity of the study. So I'm not sure they loved the vegan diet just because they stayed on it. I think pretty much what I was saying was, isn't this great for internal validity that this vegan diet that we made wasn't just rice and beans? They weren't furious. They weren't quitting because we gave them crap. They finished for 8 weeks. They ate vegan. I thought that was pretty impressive.
So was there any data at all that spoke to enjoyment of the, being satisfied with the taste? Because I think that satisfaction tool wasn't just measuring taste, right? And flavor.
Yeah, it's measuring convenience and going out. It's a very global term. So a lot of it just had to do with familiarity, convenience, taste, social opportunities. And yeah, I think a vegan diet is challenging in many of those regards.
So did people enjoy the food, the vegan
Some.
food?
So we have, just to be anecdotal, and this is not science, one of the pairs of twins has come back to us and said, can you please help us both be vegan? We both want to be vegan, and we need more help than you gave us in the study. So we've actually created a Powered by Plants website to do this. And not everyone did. Some were like, oh my God, thank God this is over. I did not want to be vegan, and I don't want to be vegan now. I think more of them are in the middle. More of them are like, I'm not going to be vegan, but a lot of those dishes I like, to be perfectly honest. That was my intent in the study. I'm not trying to make the world vegan. I just wanted people to appreciate they could eat a lot more plants in their diet and less meat.
Okay, so you're randomizing these sets of twins, 2 different diets, healthy omnivorous diet, a healthy vegan diet. They have food delivered for the first 4 weeks. The last 4 weeks they're on their own, but they have some guidelines. What are your research questions and what are you measuring? What are you actually interested in seeing?
Yeah. Okay, so here's another really important thing for the listeners and some of the critiques that we've been getting. So if you go back about 10 years, you will find that there was, within the scientific community, there's some frustration that people would start a study with one outcome in mind. And this is particularly true of human trials, but very true in particular of nutrition trials. If you get somebody recruited to be in a study and they're going to change their diet, you're going to spend all this time, you're going to try to measure everything under the sun that you can. If you have some blood, if you have some poop, if you have some questionnaires, you want to get a main paper out of this, but you also want to get pilot data for another study. So we tend to measure whatever we have the money for. We measure a lot of things. And in the past, what people were accused of was having one thing in mind that wasn't statistically significant and publishing a paper of one of the other things that was statistically significant as if that was their main purpose. It's like, that's disingenuous. So you now can't get a study published in a journal unless you've submitted it ahead of time to something called clinicaltrials.gov. And on the clinicaltrials.gov website, which is available to the public, anybody can search a name or a title or something. You have to pick one primary outcome, and then you can pick as many secondary outcomes as you want. And the main thing a reviewer will look for, and I've been rejected on a paper. I guess I won't get into why this was rejected. Actually, it was Diet Fits that got rejected by the New England Journal of Medicine, because we went in saying we were going to look at insulin resistance as defined by area under the curve of an oral glucose tolerance test. And over the course of this study, it became clear that most people studying insulin resistance were publishing on a related variable called insulin 30 minutes into the oral glucose tolerance test. How high did the insulin go? So we wrote up a massive thing and we said, we're going to look at it always, but given that most investigators are doing this now, we have decided to switch one of the primary outcomes to insulin 30 instead of insulin area under the curve. The New England Journal of Medicine rejected it at the desk level because we switched. Mm-hmm. It's the most famous study I ever did, most impactful study I ever did, and the rationale was strong for that. The rationale would have been worse if I had said TMAO, but I switched to LDL, like completely unrelated. So our primary outcome for this study was LDL cholesterol. that is really not rocket science. A vegan diet, which is higher in fiber and lower in saturated fat, should lower LDL cholesterol.
Right, which is, it's not rocket science, but some people have criticized the study for that reason. They've said, it's not that the vegan diet is inherently beneficial. It's not magic. It's just that there are differences in the nutrient contents of these two diets. We know when someone eats a diet that's lower in saturated fat and more fiber, as you say, LDL cholesterol is going to go down. It's not groundbreaking.
It is not groundbreaking in any way. So what was interesting was we really wanted to look at everything. We wanted sort of a composite score of health. You can't get that funded and you can't get that published if it's a fishing expedition. So if you leave the outcome wide open, if I were to write an NIH grant that way, I would never get it funded. And if I were going to publish it, I would never get it funded. So it has to say you picked one thing, and then there's usually two other levels. One is secondary things. So in fact, some of the criticisms that I saw had to do with why did you measure HDL and triglycerides when those aren't important? I said, well, when you measure LDL, you always get an HDL and a triglyceride with it. It's just sort of part of the packet. Why would you not report it? So I wasn't focused on that. But the overall lipid profile and insulin and glucose and inflammatory markers and the microbiome, it's a fascinating package, but there is a scientific approach. You have to pick one, label the others as secondary. You have to lead in the study with the one that you picked first. And then you're welcome to present all the others as long as you identified what the first one was. And we looked at a lot of other things, and I hope we get into that because some of them we didn't look at, and people have accused me of cherry picking only the things that worked.
Yeah, I think I saw Nina Teicholz do a tweet on exactly that.
So can I take a moment?
Take a moment. Take a deep breath and then
okay, deep breath.
Load up.
So I think Louis Sahoyos is brilliant. I think that hit 3 on Netflix and was there for 2 weeks because of all the different pieces that he wrapped together. I never saw the finished product before it was released.
The documentary.
The documentary. I got interviewed a lot. I knew when there were cameras and not. But one of the initial issues that came up was as we were doing this, Louis kept thinking of more things to measure once we had agreed to do it. And we sort of had a price tag for this. And as we started adding up, I said, Louis, we can't do everything. Can't measure everything under the sun. He said, I really want to do body composition and dual energy X-ray absorptiometry.
DEXA scan.
DEXA scan. And I said, I'm familiar with that. I've done it before. We actually have a machine here on campus.
Yeah, and that's interesting. Like if you're thinking about this study, is there changes with regards to visceral fat or lean mass, muscle?
So I wasn't expecting much of a body composition change in just 8 weeks. He wanted to have Nimai Delgado in this as a trainer and offer this to everyone.
I'm training with him later today, actually.
How funny. And so we sort of looked at the expense of that. And Nimai has an online version. And he said, well, but I'd like really take, so they had picked, I don't know, haven't said this yet, but for the documentary, because we didn't go there were 4 pairs of twins that were selected in advance that they would follow throughout. They couldn't follow 22 pairs throughout. That would have been just prohibitive. So they were following 4 pairs, and they gave them one-on-ones with Nimai a couple times and filmed it.
How did they choose those 4 sets of twins out of the 22?
They interviewed them and they thought these are going to be the most mediagenic is a term that I would have used. They didn't pick them.
But they weren't aware of the results.
No one was aware of the results. And I imagine I had thought they picked 4 thinking maybe 2 pairs will drop out. And if those are the only 2 pairs that dropped out, we can't show them at the end. But all 4 pairs finished and they trained with Nimai. And at that point, early on, I said, Louis, I don't have enough money for this. I can't do the DEXAs and everything else you said and the biological clocks. Nope, sorry, I can't do this. He said, well, I'm going to go ahead and do it for the 4 twins that we've been following. It'll be fun to film them with Nimai. And I said, okay, great, but I'm not going to analyze that. I don't even want to see the data. That's not a study with 8 people. And how are you going to measure adherence? He said, well, we're not really going to measure adherence. I said, oh my God, in my work, I have to measure adherence to see if they actually followed the thing that they were doing in diet. And I'm not a physical activity guy, so I don't even know how to measure adherence in physical activity. That's not what, I have a simple questionnaire, but it's not very detailed. If this is important, you would want a very detailed assessment of adherence. And I certainly don't have the money for that either. So they did this, and they pretty prominently featured the DEXA scans in the documentary. And the vegans lost muscle mass. And they also lost visceral fat. So it's kind of funny. Louis was very excited that they lost the visceral fat, which is a good thing. But a lot of people who watched it said, I do not want to lose lean muscle.
Right,
That's
particularly
a bad thing.
people that are thinking, hey, this is 8 weeks. What does this look like over 10 years or 20 years?
So for me, this has been super frustrating as a number of people have written to me and say, why did you cherry pick? Why did you only see the things that worked? Because I could tell from the Netflix that the body composition thing didn't work. And so my quick response, and I wish somehow that we had been able to communicate this in the Netflix, I don't have those data. I never had those data.
That wasn't part of the study.
There's only 8 people that did it. There's no summary. There's no statistical analysis. That was for show, for part of the Netflix, not
it
me.
would be cool maybe in the future to get the funding to go back and do that.
In fact, someone said, if I had known that while you were making the movie, I would have given the money to do the DEXA. It's like, yeah, well, that doesn't work now because the study's all over. Mm-hmm. So that was a very frustrating part of the translation of the movie. Can I do another very frustrating part? Mm-hmm. Is that okay? So we hit upon it a little while ago, and I realized we skipped over it. It had to do with how many calories they ate. This ends up being very satisfying for me. Wait till you hear this part. So Trifecta delivered the same number of meals to the vegans and the omnivores in those first 4 weeks. In the diet data that we reported, the vegans ate less than the omnivores, fewer calories, which would likely explain the weight loss that we published.
Around 200 calories less per day.
Yeah. And so in the end, a couple critics said, I don't think it had anything to do with the vegan diet at all. It had to do with the weight loss. If you had maintained their weight, that would have been the way to answer the question. So this gets back to sort of the efficacy effectiveness thing. I made a tweet about this, and I was trying to point out that we delivered the same number of calories, but they ate different amounts. And what we published was what they ate. Now, I could have forced them to eat the same number of calories. And in a tutorial, I had a picture of a duck, a foie gras duck with a gavage going down its throat. Twitter didn't actually let me post that. It stripped it because I guess that was too inhumane. But it was supposed to be a joke that at that point, if you want to force people to eat the same number of calories, that's a different question. And I got to tell you why this is so satisfying, because right after the study got published, somebody on Twitter, yes, I continue to call it Twitter, said, I'm going to critique this. I looked into this. You fed them intentionally different amount of calories. This is almost unethical that you did this. You rigged the study. And I said, nope. In the kind of study I do, food delivery is sort of an extra step in rigor in the first place. We delivered the same number of calories. They ate different levels. That's either because they were satiated because of the high fiber of the vegan diet, or unfamiliar with it and just didn't want to eat any more of the vegan food. But I don't even know that part. But they really did eat less. But it was not by design because they got the same number of calories. So one of my critics on Twitter is Dr. Tro. And he has criticized many of my studies over time. And one of the most satisfying moments in life was I wrote this tutorial
Correcting him.
explaining that. And he wrote me back. And this is not even just a tweet. This was a video. He videotaped himself saying, I would like to offer an apology to Dr. Gardner. I was rude and critiqued this, not understanding. I'm still a little confused why he did some of the things he did. But based on his explanation, I realized that I inappropriately critiqued his design of the study.
That's a nice bit of self-reflection.
Oh my God, that was like better than Netflix, that I got an apology on social media in a video, and I wrote right back. And, there was one point where we were disagreeing on something, and I agreed with him. And I wrote, Dr. Tro, isn't this great? We agree on something. So I feel like this is coming back to me. I pointed out we don't disagree on everything. And so this is one where he gave it back to me and said, sorry for critiquing you. I should have at least asked and got more details.
Come back to the outcomes. So LDL cholesterol is the primary outcome. There's these other outcomes like insulin and HDL and triglycerides and body weight, blood glucose.
Those are all in the main manuscript, as well as a couple nutrients. B12, if you want to get into it, we will probably
TMAO.
later. Iron, TMAO. Yeah, so there's some dietary components published on the cholesterol and some other things. TMAO, which ended up being a little confusing. And then stuff that hasn't been published. So the microbiome data is going to be a separate paper. And then very intriguing and surprising results. We did this epigenetic analysis of biological clocks with a group called True Diagnostics. And I thought this would be useless. I didn't think anything could possibly come of it. And the guys doing this said, wow, this is really interesting. I can't wait to unblind the results because one group did better than the other. And this had to do with telomeres and the epigenetic clocks, which all suggested that one group was a little younger or sort of hedging the bet somehow.
And so those are markers that are predictive of lifespan?
Right. And so I don't know that they're really going to live any longer, but these are some measures that are predictive of lifespan that are new to me.
the preprint. Has that also been published?
So the preprint was out, so people could critique it if they wanted. For whatever reason, the telomeres weren't in there. And so it came back. We got some great comments back from the preprint. And so Varun has rewritten that paper, added the telomeres back. It's submitted to a journal. We got the reviewer comments back, and it's almost ready to go back. I'm optimistic that will be published very soon. The microbiome data are still months away from being published. Interestingly, the Sonnenbergs, which do the microbiome, have taken what they said were very interesting findings from the study and gone back to do more experiments in mice to explain mechanistically what they saw. So working with the Sonnenbergs, and I know they've been on your show before.
A couple times.
Yeah, super fun I really enjoy working with Justin, and he has multiple times pointed out that our collaboration together has been very novel for him. In the past, he would work on mice and ask questions and say, this may have relevance to humans, but we'll probably never test that because humans are a pain in the butt and we do mice. He's flipped that, and so now I collect poop in all my studies and hand it over to him. And when he finds something, rather than just publishing it, he can't quite understand why that microbe appeared or disappeared or the effect on inflammatory markers. And so instead of just publishing that, he wants to go back to so reverse it. Instead of going from mice to humans, he's going from humans to mice
down.
To see, well, now that I know something happened in humans, could I use a mouse model to mechanistically explain what that was so that I can be clear when I present these results? So there's a couple graduate students working on it. They found some very cool things, and it should be out soon, but not as soon as the telomere data and the biological clock data, which hopefully will be out in the next month or two.
Look forward to that. So you measure these cardiometabolic kind of related outcomes. You have microbiome stuff. You have epigenetics. Coming back to the cardiometabolic stuff that you published, your hypothesis was that LDL cholesterol would be significantly lower on the vegan diet.
Yes.
What did you have a hypothesis or hypotheses for the other cardiometabolic outcomes like insulin and fasting glucose?
Yeah, I thought because of more fiber in the vegan diet that you'd see a better response for glucose and insulin, sort of a more slow release of nutrients. They would have higher carbs. They did. But higher carbs that were a lower glycemic index. And so wasn't sure if the combination of higher carb but lower glycemic index and therefore a lower glycemic load might improve those.
And you were measuring these at baseline and at 8 weeks
and 4 weeks
and 4
everything.
weeks. So you could see what happened while people were being provided food and what happens in even more of a free living context when they're on their own.
And just to be clear, so when you set this up ahead of time and publish it in ct.gov, clinicaltrials.gov, you also have to say the time point. So we specifically said baseline versus 8 week. So if you look at 4 week, That's not part of the original statistical plan. That's considered exploratory, and you have to stick with the 8-week thing. So what we published was the 8-week change.
If someone's wondering, why measure LDL cholesterol and not LDL particle or ApoB? That some folks might say they're even more predictive of cardiovascular disease.
That's a good question. Yeah, if I could go back, I would do that. If I had more money, I could go back and actually, I have stored blood. I could look at the ApoB. You can also look at the triglycerides as a hint. And here's an interesting critique of this study also is the people that, if you look at the main results, the triglycerides were up a little in the vegans and didn't change so much in the omnivores, which a lot of people that favor that small, dense LDL particle size hypothesis say, oh my God, they totally blew it. They didn't look. The triglycerides were way higher in the vegans. Not true. If you look at the p-value,
they weren't significantly high.
P-value wasn't even close to significant. And really what happens in triglycerides is you have these massively wide confidence intervals because human triglyceride levels are much more variable than LDL or HDL. Sorry to geek out there.
Yeah, you mentioned HDL before. And the difference in HDL was non-significant.
Right. But went down a little more in vegans.
Went down a little more in vegans. And that was another criticism that Mark Hyman had. He wondered why in the abstract you only spoke about LDL cholesterol and not HDL. My take on that, or I'm presuming that's because the LDL cholesterol finding was significant and the HDL was not.
It was primary and it was significant. And usually in the abstract, you can't go through all the secondary outcomes that you did. There isn't enough room in the abstract. I feel like these days HDL isn't as exciting as it used to be. A lot of people are considered it less of a causal factor. And we've actually had RCTs where they raised HDL and it was not protective. It's been more along the lines of observational that, wow, it sure looks like people with high HDL have better health outcomes. That doesn't necessarily mean raising it will help. Does that mean lowering it hurts? So I don't think anybody's ever tried to lower HDL to see if it would decrease your lifespan. But I've seen much less enthusiasm for HDL these days. But when you do this type of study, if you didn't list LDL, HDL, and triglyceride, a reviewer would critique right away and say, where's the full lipid profile?
Right. Yeah, I know someone like Thomas Dayspring, who's been on this show, would say he doesn't trust any ratio with HDL in it anymore.
Yeah.
As a predictor of risk of cardiovascular disease. I just thought then, though, you don't have ApoB data, but I think non-HDL very closely approximates ApoB, which could be analyzed without having to run more tests.
I could definitely go back and look at that. We could pay more money and thaw some blood and look at ApoB. I'd be happy to do that in the future.
How were the results analyzed? Because I know this was an open label study in that you can't blind the subject to what diet they're eating. You kind of know if you're in the omnivorous or the vegan group. But the researchers in your team, they were blinded.
Absolutely. So not the dietitians who are asking what they're eating, not the health educators who are telling them how to eat the most healthful diet. They all knew. But anyone analyzing results was blinded. We said orange and purple. Mm-hmm. And so nobody knows till the end, till we unblind. That's why the folks doing the biological clock said, God, can you please tell us which one this is? Multiple times, Louis, the producer, came to us and said, when can we unblind? Because something's different, and I can't wait to see what it is, and I'm praying and hoping for the sake of my film that this works, but nobody's telling me which direction they're going in. We keep it blinded till the end.
And what were the main takeaways or main results for these cardiometabolic markers?
LDL was lower, insulin was
significantly lower.
And body weight was lower, which I hadn't expected in that short amount of time. LDL, one thing that not many people have picked up on, which I think is interesting, just because you randomize doesn't mean people will be exactly the same, and it's impossible that they're exactly the same on everything. Given that LDL was the primary outcome, the vegans had a lower LDL at baseline than the ones assigned to omnivore. They had less room for improvement. They were You might have the numbers in front of you, and I'm not sure I remember, but it's something like the vegans were about 100 and the omnivores were about 110 or 114 maybe.
At baseline?
At baseline.
Vegans were 110 and the omnivores were 118.
Okay. So that means there's less room for improvement, right? And so the vegans, so the outcome of interest is the change. So one of the worst things in science is if you have two groups like this, and at the end of the day, this group lowers it to here. I don't know who's watching and who's listening right now, so I can't see what I just did with my hands, right? So I'll just say, if you were, let's say you're 118, and sorry, what were the vegans again? 110?
110.
Yeah. So what if one group lowered from 118 to 110 and 110 stayed the same? And you could just say, fabulous. This group lowered their outcome and this group remained the same. They win. And somebody else looks at it and says, they both ended up at 110. Well, how does that mean somebody won? Maybe 110 is the basement and you can't go any lower than 110.
But it might be easier to fall the higher you are.
Yeah. So that, and I've seen a couple of studies like that, and then you have to trip all over yourself trying to come up with the words to explain why. I know they ended up in the same place, but I still think it's important. In this case, the vegans who were already lower lowered their LDL cholesterol by another 14 points or something like that. And the omnivores barely moved. So not only did they have more than a 10% drop in LDL cholesterol, they did it in the face of having an unwanted lower LDL than the omnivores at baseline. Maybe too geeky, but I actually think that strengthens the point
Definitely.
that they did better.
Yeah, I was trying to interpret what that means for risk of cardiovascular disease.
Oh.
And I'll share with you where, how I kind of tried to calculate that. And you can tell me what you think. So looking at the paper, I think the difference was about 14 milligrams per deciliter in terms of the lowering of LDL cholesterol between the two groups. So the vegans had a 14 milligrams per deciliter greater reduction in LDL cholesterol over 8 weeks. And do you know Kevin Mackey? Have you come across his work?
Sure.
Oh, you know him?
Yeah.
So he wrote this paper, I'll put this into the show notes, that was trying to determine the reduction in cardiovascular disease risk that you get when adopting a plant-based dietary pattern.
Uh-huh.
And one of the kind of neat things that he did was he went and looked at genetic Mendelian randomization studies and looked at, okay, we know we have these populations of people that have genetically low LDL cholesterol. We can now work out for every 1 millimoles per liter lowering, which is 18 milligrams per deciliter. I'm going off my head here.
Yeah.
We know that if exposed to that over a lifetime, because that matters, right? Cholesterol years, then these people have about a 50 to 55% reduction in risk of cardiovascular disease. So 18 milligrams per deciliter for every 18 milligrams per deciliter lower LDL cholesterol. If maintained over the lifetime, you get this 50 to 55% reduction. Okay, so then I was looking at your results. It's a 14 milligram per deciliter difference. So not all the way to this 18, but it's about 40% of it. Sorry, it's about 80% of it.
Yeah.
Which we could kind of extrapolate and say that if the subjects in this study were able to maintain that diet over decades of their life, it could be around a 40% reduction in risk of cardiovascular disease.
Yeah, it's not true. It's clinically significant, that drop. In my day, back 30 years ago, we used cut points of 130, 160, and 190. And so if you had people, I would often recruit people with elevated LDL, which was between 130 and 160, and try to get it below 130. Today, that would be a joke. The drugs are there to put the LDL at 50 or 70. So the goal now is under 100 or to 70 or under 70 or to 50. So diet's not going to do that. But that drop you just mentioned is clinically significant. Could be not being on a drug, or it could be on a lower dose of drug if you add a diet to it. Clinically relevant. Absolutely.
How much of that reduction is due to the difference in calorie intake and weight loss?
So you could tease that apart if you wanted. And you could tease apart the amount due to the fiber and the part due to the saturated fat, and you could tease it all apart, which is why there should be multiple studies, not just one. So we only have one. We didn't tease it apart.
But
How much would go
if you were to
away?
guess,
Oh
or
yeah, no, you
hypothesize?
could make, so one of my studies years ago, one of my first big published studies was in the Annals of Internal Medicine, and we made 2 low-fat diets, and one was very convenience food-based, and one was very plant food-based. And so convenience food had chicken without the skin and mashed potatoes with light margarine and sugar-free cookies. And the other one had lentil soup with cheese on it, whole grain bread with butter on it, and a salad with egg in it. And the reason I said lentil with cheese and bread with butter and salad with egg is we matched the saturated fat and total fat and cholesterol in the 2 diets in a feeding study, and we forced them to keep the same calories. So actually, we fed them for a month.
So you've done what Peter Attia wanted you to do.
So every 3 days, if their weight was up or down in one direction, they got more calories added or calories taken away. So this is a 2005 publication. And I never said it out loud, but it was a vegetarian versus an omnivore diet. So just because those words can be polarizing, I just said this is a plant-based diet and this is a more typical diet. And when we did that, we doubled the LDL cholesterol lowering in the group that did plant-based at the same level of total fat and the same level of saturated fat. Very different fiber, very different antioxidants, but weight was maintained. So the convenience food group lowered their LDL by 7 milligrams per deciliter because it was a lower saturated fat diet than their usual. And the plant-based folks lowered it by 14 milligrams per deciliter. Same number.
So essentially what that tells us is that independent of any weight loss or difference in saturated fat, there are other properties of a plant-based diet that can lead to cholesterol lowering.
Yes.
And that could be it could be fiber. It could be less dietary cholesterol as well, which might have a little bit of an impact.
Little. Yeah.
Tiny.
Tiny, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
This episode is proudly brought to you by Inside Tracker. Track your blood biomarkers, understand your biological age, and receive personalized lifestyle tips backed by evidence to optimize your health. To get started with Inside Tracker today and get 20% off your first purchase, head to insidetracker.com/Simon. That's insidetracker.com/Simon for 20% off.
Okay, I think that segues nicely into Peter Attia's kind of central critique. I don't want to go over too many of the things that he said. I think there was one main critique that he had. He wrote this blog titled "A Study Comparing the Effects of Vegan and Omnivorous Diets Fails Science 101." Boy, did he come out swinging in this. He described the study as, and I quote, "categorical failure to isolate and test a specific independent variable, which, as emphasized in any 6th grade science class, is perhaps the most basic requirement for hypothesis testing." And he goes on to point out that the vegan group ate about 200 calories less per day and consumed significantly less saturated fat throughout the study, and says these differences could easily mean that the increased weight loss and greater reduction in LDL cholesterol relative to baseline among vegan participants were the results of lower intake of total calories and saturated fat, rather than to a vegan diet per se.
Yep, this is an, oh my God, Peter, what century are you living in? And this is particularly stunning given how much work Peter and I did on Diet Fits and low fat, low carb. So let's go back just for a minute. He helped me get millions of dollars to expand Diet Fits. NIH gave me $3 million and Peter helped me get $5 million. Make it the best study I ever did. Absolutely best scientific, most cited ever. And we did not isolate one variable in low fat and low carb. To eat low fat versus low carb many things were different. You can't just have all the same food and have it be low fat and low carb. So let's go to vegan versus omnivore. So I'm sure you could probably get a sixth grader to say, oh, so what's different about a vegan and an omnivorous diet? Let's see. It has less beef and less chicken and less fish and less yogurt and fewer eggs. And it has less saturated fat and no cholesterol. And it has more fiber in the vegan diet. How would you make two diet patterns that were identical in everything except one thing? And what would that one thing be? So there were days in the last century when nutrition studies were shakes. You would put a bunch of things in a blender, you would blend it up. So, and now actually, you were talking before about blinding the participants. If it was a shake, you could blind them and you could drink mushed food that you couldn't tell what it was. And you could make as many things similar as possible and hold one thing constant.
Right. But how generalizable is that to the listener or the everyday person that's just thinking, should I eat an omnivorous diet or should I eat a plant-based diet?
This is why it's so last century. Peter, what are you talking about? And this is kind of ironic that's on the heels of me being the writing chair of the American Heart Association paper that compared DASH, Mediterranean, pescatarian, vegetarian, low-fat vegan, high-fat vegan, low-fat, low-carb, paleo, and keto. We have a whole beautiful table. It's super geeky, but I hope somebody will look it up.
And it's on screen right now.
Great. And we actually broke each one of those patterns into 4 categories. Particular foods that are emphasized, particular ones that it's okay to include, particular ones that you should focus on limiting, and particular things that you have to avoid if you're going to be on this one diet. And we went through every food group. And so all the patterns differed not in one component, but in all the components and not even one level. It wasn't a yes or no. It isn't emphasize or avoid. And a really important factor in many of these dietary patterns is there are things that you don't have to emphasize. You can include, and it's benign. We're not really sure which way to go. And there's another ones that you don't have to completely restrict, but you should limit them. We don't think you should have these. And, commonly these diet patterns get identified based on the thing that they emphasize or the thing that they avoid. So if it was vegan, you're avoiding all animal products. If you're keto, you're avoiding almost all the carbs. So as you go through this list, you couldn't possibly study any of those if you isolated it to a single variable. And this goes back to one of my initial comments in our talk today. So old school nutrition was very nutrient oriented, and the term we used is isolationist reductionist. And that was really important to understand some mechanisms. For example, is it the saturated fat or is it the cholesterol that raises the blood cholesterol? It's actually the saturated fat in your diet, not the cholesterol in your diet, that raises the blood cholesterol. That was 50 years ago. That was really important to figure out. So then we sort of moved to, then is it the soy or is it the garlic or is it the whole fat dairy versus the low fat dairy? And that actually seemed more generalizable to move into the realm of foods that people would buy in a store. But then I was going to make fun of this. I'd find people say, yes, Professor Gardner, I'm doing the Mediterranean diet. Really? What'd you have today? Well, I had an Egg McMuffin for breakfast and I had a Big Mac for lunch and a Whopper for dinner. And by my nightstand, I have a little jigger of olive oil and I chug that before I go to bed. And I said, that's not Mediterranean. I thought olive oil was Mediterranean. No. It's olive oil on salads and on lentils and on whole grains. And so at that point, the community started moving more towards patterns as really being in this century and this decade more relevant to people's choices than Peter's view of isolating a single variable.
If you were to run this study as Peter kind of suggests that it should have been run, where you match calories, you match the composition of the diet, saturated fat, fiber, etc., what does that tell you versus the study that you ran, what's the difference in terms of the answers that you're getting?
Yeah, I wouldn't have answered the question that I want to answer. What happens if you go on a vegan diet? What if you eat fewer calories on a vegan diet just because it's vegan? Either it's more satiating or it's less palatable. You wish you had some other foods, but to be honest, that's part of some other strategies like intermittent fasting and how can you find a way to eat less calories. If I could go back to my tutorial for just a sec, I had a lot of fun writing the tutorial because I found in one of my other studies a ketogenic versus Mediterranean diet. It was the same design. For 4 weeks, we delivered the food, and for 8 weeks, they cooked on their own. And the keto group, even though they had the same number of calories delivered, ate 200 calories less per day than the Mediterranean group when we delivered the food. Virtually identical. No one came out of the woods to accuse me, hey, the keto folks lost a little more weight than the Mediterranean folks in your keto med diet study. Is that wrong? Did you intentionally feed them the wrong number of calories? And so it actually completely parallels this. I could have forced them to eat the same number of calories, but when they were eating keto, they ate less. Is that because it was more satiating or less palatable? I think so, some combination of that, or less familiar with it. So it's a different kind of question to isolate it like that. Can I take the saturated fat one thing further? Like, how would you make a vegan diet with a lot of saturated fat? You could add a lot of coconut.
Or palm oil, yeah.
But those chain lengths are shorter than the chain lengths in stearic acid, palmitic acid. And so then wouldn't I get a critic saying, why didn't you match the saturated fat level and the chain length of the specific fatty acids? I mean, it becomes absurd.
The point is you're really trying to get participants to eat as they would in real life if they were adopting a healthy omnivorous dietary pattern or a healthy plant-based dietary pattern. And part of that is that, like, when you shift to a healthy plant-based diet, naturally your intake of saturated fat, as long as you're not chugging down coconut or palm oil, typically goes down, and your intake of fiber typically goes up. That happens in the real world.
Yes.
Right? So what your study, the results that you're getting in that way are more applicable to that person who just shifts their dietary pattern. I'm trying to understand Peter Attia and where he's coming from, and Lane Norton had a similar critique. And so I think if we were to sit down with them, they would say, but it's possible to eat an omnivorous diet that is lower in saturated fat and is higher in fiber. It is possible. And I feel like there's a little bit of a double standard here because both Peter and Lane often say, it's possible to eat an optimal amount of protein on a plant-based diet, but it's damn hard work. This is the exact same thing in reverse. It is certainly possible to eat very low or low saturated fat and get fiber up on an omnivorous diet, but relative to a plant-based whole food dietary pattern, it's going, in my view, I would argue, it's going to take more work and more planning.
Yes. It's this continuum of, do you want to be more on the side of efficacy or effectiveness? Where do you want to do this? And I honestly hope my epitaph on my gravestone says, and he was pretty damn good at studying generalizable diet patterns, which other people didn't study that way. That wasn't very pithy, but I really feel I take tremendous pride. I think the types of studies my group does is somewhat different than most other people because of that approach of matching everything or doing observational epidemiology. The kinds of studies I do are a bitch. They have multiple variables moving at one time. And so the fun I have, the reason I'm passionate about the science I do is it's a fun puzzle and challenge. How can you make two patterns that are different and define them in an intelligent way and assess them so that you can show how closely people did adhere? And one thing I'll own right here, anytime you want to ask, not everyone adhered to the same level. And to me, that is hugely important. That is part of the science to show that even though you had a definition, even though you delivered foods, they didn't eat all the foods you delivered. Beyond that, they didn't eat all the foods I delivered, those a-holes had the huevos to tell me they didn't. When we do the diet assessment, in our keto med paper, we have a really fun graphic to show that we were delivering the keto diet. On a scale of 0 to 10, 10 would be eating all the meals we gave them. Their adherence score was 2. It's like, really? I signed you up for the study. I'm delivering this food and you're not eating it? That's important to know, that there's different levels of adherence. Does that undermine the study? Does that mean you can't analyze the results? No, in my mind, those are some of the most important results to analyze.
And
that
it probably makes it more generalizable. Like,
Yes.
You're not going to get perfect adherence in real life. So if you take a Kevin Hall metabolic ward study where you're essentially forcing people to eat all of the food, you see the results from that, but you don't know if that's going to translate into real life because of adherence.
And I cite his work all the time because I don't do the study that way. And that is a really important piece of the puzzle. I once did a conference presentation with David Ludwig, who did a really very impressive controlled study and published it in the BMJ, British Medical Journal, at the same time we did Diet Fits. And I think people in the audience missed the irony that in his study, and he was looking at people with insulin resistance on a low carb versus a low fat study. And he was looking sort of at energy expenditure with doubly labeled water. It was an elegant study. It was really beautiful. And his conclusion was kind of, well, this is going to help people in the real world. Turned out Diet Fits asked that question in the real world and it didn't work. A big part of Diet Fits was who was insulin resistant and who was insulin sensitive. And did that make a difference in weight loss? And that was the main I thought that was going to happen in that study. And it didn't. We didn't prove that hypothesis, but we were on the stage and he was saying, I have this elegant controlled study that shows that this could happen. And somehow he seemed to miss the point but we did that and it didn't. Those are two really important points and you can study them both, but they're different questions. They're importantly different.
Just quickly on that, I don't want to digress too much, but was there a reanalysis on Diet Fits?
He did
recently?
a reanalysis of Diet Fits.
And has that changed your views on that study
No.
and how to interpret it?
So actually, to be overly simplistic, early on, low carb did better. And at the end, they weren't different. And this is one of those things where I said this before in our conversation today. On clinicaltrials.gov, we said, I'm interested in the longest out point. I don't want the short-term interim. I want to see what happens after a year. And so we're going to analyze this focusing on the year. If you looked at some of the early time points, low carb group lost more fat and had some better metabolic outcomes that there was more recidivism on later in the study than there was in low fat. So they ended up in the same place. To me, I'm interested in the longer term outcome. I actually did not want to be a co-author on that paper, even though it's my data.
I want to slide over to some of the critiques that Mark Hyman had. He dedicated an entire podcast to this study. And I actually messaged Mark about this. I haven't heard back. But one of his critiques was that the control diet, the omnivorous diet, was not a healthy omnivorous diet. And he seemed to have issue with a couple of components of the diet. One is he seemed to think that their added sugar intake either increased through the study or was significantly higher than the vegan group for added sugars that was. And he also didn't like the fact that the omnivorous diet had about 5 to 6 serves of whole grains or starches a day. And he kind of used that to say that, in his view, this meant that this was not a healthy omnivorous diet. And his argument being that saturated fat is really only bad in the context of a background diet with a lot of carbs. And he says saturated fat will help increase LDL particle size, raise HDL, etc. if you don't eat it with carbs. It's really what you don't eat it with. Saturated fat is not in and of itself inherently bad. For most of us, it's okay.
Yeah, so it was probably hard to tell from the figures that we put in the paper. That's why we're coming out with a completely separate paper that lists baseline and 4 weeks and 8 weeks for within vegan group, within the omnivore group, and then between them. And if you go through it and you look at the number one graphic in this paper, you'll see that the healthy eating index increased in the omnivores relative to their baseline study. And that increase wasn't due to any one thing. It was due to multiple things. But they ate more vegetables, they reduced their added sugars, they reduced their refined grains. And many of the things between vegans and omnivores were not different. They both increased in a healthy way. I probably have to look at a table's worth of values, which I have in front of me right now if we were to take the time to look. But without taking the time to look, that criticism is unfair. If you look at this table, you will see that there were many improvements. Their grain intake did not go up on the omnivorous diet. If anything, it went down.
Added sugars actually went down
Significantly, yes.
So when I looked at that, and I appreciate these aren't published yet, right? These tables, so people will get the chance to review them. But in the omnivorous group, there was an increase in intake of animal protein, eggs, meat, and fish, and then there was less calories. If anything, I don't think it was significant, but less calories from carbs in the omnivorous group, and that is all things that someone like Mark Hyman would actually recommend. So the point that I'm making here is, if anything, through that trial, those subjects were moving more towards a diet that someone like him would kind of put forward.
Yes.
We spoke about his critique of not having HDL in the abstract. We've spoken about LDL cholesterol. We've spoken about why the documentary included DEXA scans, but they weren't in your study. These are all things that he raised. He and others did raise a concern about the length of the study with respect to observing deficiencies. And so his position was, and I'm quoting again, by definition, a vegan diet is nutrient deficient. Have you thought about the duration of the study and what we can or cannot say about the nutritional adequacy of it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And so one of the ones that comes up is B12. That certainly is everybody's knee-jerk reaction for a vegan diet, that it's deficient in B12. So a little known fact that people don't appreciate is animals don't actually make B12 either when we eat animal food. B12 is made by microorganisms, bacteria that's on the dirt on food, and animals eat dirty food. The reason they have B12 is because they ate dirty food. So we could eat, as humans, dirty food, but we're probably not going to. Or we could eat animals. Or we could fortify our food or take a supplement. So of any vitamin and mineral, nothing has a lower recommended daily allowance than B12. It's 3 micrograms a day. Not milligrams, not grams. It's 3 micrograms a day. And the most deleterious effects of that long-term are neurodegenerative disease, losing the myelin sheathing on your nerve cells. And it can take a decade for that to manifest. So to propose a study with LDL cholesterol as an outcome, which can change in 2 weeks, if you change from diet A to diet B in a steady way, your LDL will change for 2 weeks and then that change will plateau. And then why don't you just keep going for 10 years to see if the B12 was deficient? You couldn't ever make that argument unless B12 was the primary variable, and it wasn't. So when you pick a duration of a study, you're more obligated to pick the primary outcome than an exploratory outcome, and B12 was certainly exploratory and expected that it would go down.
Yeah, why include it if you already know it's going to go down? These subjects, I'm assuming, were not supplementing with B12.
Yeah, but they probably got some in fortified food. But interestingly, so we, sort of as an adherence check, we wanted to show that the vegans went from some level of cholesterol, dietary cholesterol, to 0. That's only in animal foods. So that was pretty cool that it went to 0 and it stayed relatively the same for the omnivores. Likewise, to show that the B12 drops precipitously is a sign of adherence to the diet. And it could be a follow-up of, well, if you're going to continue to do this, given the importance of B12, you should make sure you take a B12 supplement or get some fortified food, which is pretty easy to do.
Yeah, I thought it was somewhat rich of Mark to kind of call out this nutrient deficiency thing. And again, I know Mark, I think he's a nice guy, and I hope that he would keep me honest as well if I was kind of inconsistent, because at the start of his podcast, he says, I'm a big proponent of supplements because our food just isn't as nutritious as it once was, and then goes on to promote a supplement company. So it seems like somewhat of a double standard to me.
I'm going to leave that untouched. Yes.
He said that you have a personal bias towards a plant-based diet because that's how you eat, and therefore that's a conflict of interest.
Yeah. So this is such a great point to bring up. There was some social media on this, and it kind of made me laugh. Like, okay, so really, as a vegan, I should only be able to study non-vegan diets, and as for somebody who's a fan of the keto diet, they should only study non-keto. I guess the problem is everyone eats. So at one point, I very flippantly wanted to say the only nutrition scientists who should be allowed to do studies are people that don't eat. Because you have to eat something. I eat what I do after decades of study and personal examination. Why would I not do that? If I can throw in a flip here, my wife is a political scientist. She gets asked to talk to the media all the time about politics. And she had a bumper sticker on her car. And at one point, the news media said, we can't come back anymore. And she said, why? I said, well, you're not objective. You have a bumper sticker on your car about who to elect for president. You're not objective. She's like, I've been studying politics my entire life. I care about democracy. I have an opinion. They now come back and talk to her. But at one point, the irony of that being a lack of objectivity, because in a field you study, you have a preference over a candidate, to me would be like, after a lifetime of study, I do eat every day. How could that be a conflict? To broaden that, there are a lot of industry-funded studies where Marianne Nestle has written a lot about this. If you are the egg board and you do an egg study, you would benefit financially for a favorable result. I'm not sure how I would benefit financially from a result of studying what I'm studying, unless you want to go into my plant-based initiative at all, because I'm not selling supplements. I'm not selling books. I would be critical of someone who stood to gain financially from doing something, but I'm pretty clean there. I don't sell anything.
Speaking of funding, I know there's been a couple of kind of questions raised here. I think your funding was partly grant funding, and then there was some funding from, is it Vogt Foundation?
VOGT, Kyle
Vogt Foundation.
Very much an animal rights and welfare person.
So they're into like ocean preservation, and I think from the outside in, people have seen that and have then leapt to the conclusion that, okay, they're funding this study because they want to preserve the oceans. So it would be in their best interest if the vegan diet comes out favorable. And the speculation is that when money is coming from a funder like that, that they are somehow influencing study design results, and therefore, the impact that this can have on, in this case, the ocean environment.
Right. So, I have to question somebody who's upset about somebody who cares about the ocean versus somebody who cares about selling more of the product that they make. If the NIH would fund more of this, we would go to the National Institutes of Health or the National Science Foundation or any number of objective governmental funding agencies, or American Heart or Robert Wood Johnson. But there honestly isn't enough money to do all these studies. So sometimes you have to take, or you have the opportunity to take money from someone else. And I would say I actually, back in the day when I did take money from Beyond Meat to study Swap Meat, which was a study of the Beyond Meat product that they covered, I was pretty proud of myself. Before this study actually was published, I put out I put out a tutorial that said, okay, so I registered this on clinicaltrials.gov. The data are open to the public. We had a data lockdown. We had a third-party statistician analyze this. And here are 6 industry-funded studies that I took money for that all had null findings. I have a great track record, actually, of publishing null findings from industry-funded studies. And yet, I do have my own personal dietary practices, and I did get money from Vote Foundation. There isn't any way to remove all the potential bias. So it's an absolutely fair criticism. And I can tell you that the Vote Foundation, I actually had no interaction with them other than meeting Kyle Vogt on Zoom one time. If anybody I had contact with, it was a lot with Louis. And Louis has dedicated his life to this. He did The Cove and won some kind of Academy Award thing for
Incredible documentary
for that. And he did Game Changers, and he's been a National Geographic photographer, and he did this. He is definitely biased and passionate about this. But if you've seen him, he was kind of like Ethan Brown from Beyond Meat. Both of them I really enjoyed working with. They both said, this is what we do for a living, and if we're wrong, then it would be important to know that we're wrong. We would like to see the science. So neither of them had undue influence on the design or the interpretation of the results, but I can say that, and there's no way for me to back that up.
And just to be clear, you're saying, you're speaking about Beyond Meat funding the swap meat trial. They didn't fund this twin study.
Oh, and can we address that? Because that's pretty fun. So I do have some funding for them to do a plant-based diet initiative on campus. And that is, I'm actually trying to network people on campus that are interested in diet and learn about different perspectives from colleagues. That aside, and the swap meat study aside that I did, Beyond Meat didn't fund anything that was involved with this study. And I hadn't even thought of this. And thank God someone on Twitter came and saved me. And they said, did anybody really pay attention to the documentary? Pat Brown from Impossible was featured. And a novel alternative protein group from Berkeley was featured. If Beyond Meat had funded this, why were their competitors featured in the docuseries and not Beyond Meat? So I think that's the best defense of that. Beyond Meat had nothing to do with funding this.
So those rumors were really just because in prior study you had received funding from Beyond Meat. So people just kind of assume that.
And because I have this other thing, and let me give you a fun legal twist. So the money that we have for our plant-based diet initiative, which came from Beyond Meat, had to go through some lawyers who are very protective of Stanford's brand. And I'm actually not allowed to study Beyond Meat with the plant-based diet initiative money. So it's infrastructure money. It covers a postdoc. It covers some other things. But if we are to run a study, we can't use their money to study it. We could actually take somebody else's money to study it. We can't take their money to study it. And we can't even accept free Beyond Meat products for the study because it would violate the terms of the gift. The gift is unrestricted funds. And if the unrestricted funds go to studying them, then we're seen as a research arm of Beyond Meat, and that would be very bad for Stanford's name. So I can't study Beyond Meat with the plant-based diet initiative money.
Nina Teicholz criticized you for teaching students about sustainability when you're in the School of Medicine, not sociology. And she said, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here, that you're not interested in nutrition and human health outcomes, that you're interested in workers' rights, animal welfare, and environmental health. Did you hear that?
Oh, I absolutely heard it, and I would love to unpack that. So I'm a nutrition scientist. If you look at my publication record, it's all about nutrition and health. I have like 150 publications. I've done 25 randomized trials. They've pretty much all been on that. An epiphany I had a decade ago was despite exceeding all my expectations in life. So I can't remember if I told you this, but all I wanted 30 years ago was to start a vegetarian restaurant. Mm-hmm. And by mistake, I got a PhD. And by mistake, I got a professorship at Stanford. And by mistake, I got millions of dollars to do studies. Exceeded all my expectations, published studies that I think have strong relevance to what people eat. And I was seeing behavior was not changing. And at one point, it was very frustrating that having exceeded my expectations, it seemed like my impact was null. And a colleague and I started to teach a class at Stanford where we shook hands and said, let's try something a little different. Let's not talk about health. Let's only talk about societal external implications for food choices. And we'll just leave health on the side because we already do that for our whole career. Let's talk about climate change and human labor abuse in slaughterhouses and animal rights and welfare. And it was career changing for me because the students were so engaged in social justice, environmental justice. And I was watching the changes in class that they were talking about making, and they were all aligned with the changes that I had hoped they would make for health-based reasons. And so I came up with a term, or sure I stole it from someone, stealth nutrition, which is not stealth in a deceitful way. I'm not trying to trick anyone. Stealth nutrition to me is recognizing that not everybody wants to learn about the cholesterol homeostasis pathway or antioxidant effects on inflammatory cytokines or things like that. Some of them get really jazzed for social or environmental justice. And in my mind, they're very much aligned, these different choices. And so for me, it was an epiphany that I could continue to do my health-based studies. But if I was hoping to study ways to achieve behavior change, I better take some other disciplines into account. So Nina might have called it sociological, but actually I'm thrilled that on the Stanford campus, there's a school of business, law, engineering, earth sciences, education, medicine, and humanities and sciences. And I'm finding foodies in all of them. And to find someone who has a legal or a business or a psychological angle on food is fun. It's just scientifically fun to cross disciplines and see what you could do together rather than apart. Mm-hmm. Guilty of thinking beyond health.
Guilty of caring for the environment.
Guilty of caring for humans and the planet. Yes.
How dare you?
Sorry.
If Mark Hyman was here, I think he would push back a little bit and he would say, I think you use the word aligned. He would say that a plant-based diet is not necessarily best for environmental health. And I've heard him kind of make this argument. I think he's written books about this. He has a passion for regenerative agriculture. And, I have to say there are a lot of things in his message that both of us would, I assume you as well as I, would agree with.
Absolutely.
His dietary
yes.
advice. He thinks things like factory farming are bad. He thinks we should probably look at reducing monocropping. But he doesn't see a kind of shift to a plant-based diet as ultimately a solution to solve climate change. The system that he sees is a shift to regenerative agriculture, so farming animals in a different way. And at least from my understanding, I've had environmental scientists on the show, and they've made something very clear to me, which I probably didn't appreciate. You asked me actually off air what's something I didn't appreciate 10 years ago. And one of those things was that factory farming and monocropping is good at some things. And what it's good at is producing a lot of calories from less land. It's intensive, right? And if you're going to shift from intensive to extensive animal agriculture, if you want to produce the same amount of calories, you have to use an incredibly much more land.
Yes.
Is required. And where does that land come from? Right? It's going to result in mass deforestation. So where I would disagree with Mark is that, if you're talking about the individual, just like one person adopting his diet, then sure. I think his diet that he puts forward is a healthy dietary pattern. I don't think it's scalable at a global population level to feed the world and look after the planet at the same time, because it would, based on the data that I've seen, would result in mass deforestation.
And this is something I'm not an expert in, but because of this class that I started teaching 10 years ago, I've looked into this more and more and more. Stan Brockstrom, Marco Springman, Walter Willett, Tillman and Clark, Poor and Nemechek. I gave a whole American Heart Association keynote talk on sustainability. That was back in 2021 or 22. I have a whole presentation that they didn't record, but I went ahead and recorded it myself and put it on my YouTube channel. It's not as fun as standing in front of a podium. But as I went through it, one of my main statements was, is it just that we don't know about this? I sort of gave this talk right as COP26 was happening. COP is the conference of what's P? Anyway, all the countries get together once a year. We just had COP28, Conference of the Proceedings, it's all very environmental. And instead of the Paris Climate Agreement from years ago, this is an annual event that goes on. And in it, President Biden said, we should be more concerned with methane. And in his whole talk, nothing came up about cattle. And that's one of the main emitters of methane in climate change. And Secretary of Ag, Tom Vilsack, said, we don't really have to eat any less meat. We can eat the same amount of meat. We just have to do some other things better. And I was like, in my talk, I cited all these people who all had thousands of citations and altmetric scores in the 4, 5, and 6,000s. So social media, traditional scientific consensus. There is so much literature on this that we have to eat less meat. It could be better meat, less meat, better meat. I'm all in for that. So the regenerative thing, about 99% of the livestock that's eaten in the US comes from concentrated animal feeding operations. And that's actually brought up in the Netflix movies, what those percentages are. It's not my expertise, but I have read so much that says, Mark Hyman, that is not scalable. Which papers are you reading?
Right. Yeah, I'd love just to see him, recognize it's not scalable and therefore come out with that message of, hey, if you're going to eat better meat or better animal products, you need to reduce the amount if this is going to be something that is scalable.
And I would be fine. I'm really not trying to get the world to go vegan. I really actually like the phrase less meat, better meat. That's so much more acceptable to so many more people. It would bring them all in under a bigger umbrella than be vegan and be polarizing and be condescending about it.
A great book that covers a lot of the research you just mentioned from Joseph Poore and others is a book that just came out from Hannah Ritchie.
Oh, yes.
She's from Our World in Data.
She is my hero.
She wrote a book called Not the End of the World.
Yes.
I think that's what it's called. People can look it up.
She is brilliant, elegant, great communicator.
Yeah. So highly recommend people get that book. I've read it. I'm going to have her on the show and we'll unpack it. She's been on before. We're getting to the end here. I'm interested, critiques in science are not always bad. I mean, they're necessary and they're in many ways they're helpful. It's part of the scientific process is to have others look at your work and review it. And I'm sure there are, certain people's opinions who you value more than others. But I'm wondering, since the study was published, are there any critiques that you've kind of gone, you know what? That's actually a good critique. I had a little bit of a blind spot. Next time I would do that differently.
Oh, yeah, not in a big way, but some of the things like doing the ApoB, that would have been a no-brainer, the small dense LDL particle size. If I'd had the money, I would have done a full-on insulin resistance test, more something like an oral glucose tolerance test, but that was prohibitive for cost. I definitely would have done the DEXAs for everybody and the body composition. Most of them were lack of funding, not design critiques that, you should have matched the calories, you should have matched the nutrients, you should have been a longer study. So all the design issues that are in there are scientifically sound and appropriate, given that this is just one study and can't measure everything, or were due to cost constraints that we just didn't have enough money to do something else. So far, I haven't seen anything that led me to believe, I really blew the design to have the biggest impact. I should have changed this part of the design. I feel like the design is very defensible, partly because it's like the design I've done in the last 10 studies, which is what I built my career on, studying diet patterns, trying to be clear about what they are, doing a great job assessing it, not perfect, it's self-report. So all the pieces are there. I always could have done more outcomes, larger sample size, longer duration.
And when did you personally get to watch You Are What You Eat, the documentary, for the first time?
Oh, 2 weeks before the release and 2 weeks after the paper was published. And I actually had no idea who was in the movie. I didn't know Cory Booker was in it. I didn't know Eric Adams was in it. I did not know the pornography and the female genitalia was in it. That actually I find disturbing that it's so few people. That's not science. But I have very few critiques about it because Louis put the whole thing together and tens of millions of people watched it. And I have got emails from thousands of people who have changed their diet from it. So if I had had more say in it, not as many people would have watched it. I would have been more cautious. I would have done something slightly different. But he, for the most part, added science and made it engaging and entertaining. It's actually been really fun for me to think, again, from this angle of scientific communication, how can we get the general public more engaged in being more effectively critical of science? And I think we have to include them in more of science. So this wasn't perfect, but sort of like a Bill Nye the Science Guy. He's a phenomenon. He made science fun.
Do you know that's the name of our Wi-Fi here?
Oh, really? Yeah. I really think science could be more fun, and he made it more engaging and fun. I'm passionate about the work I do. I love doing nutrition science. I recognize it's confrontational, controversial, personal. It's fun. It's a fun challenge. And Simon, I love what you do in your show, trying to bring these perspectives out. So huge kudos to you for all you do. And I'm always thrilled when you ask me to come because this is such a great experience for me. And I know so many people benefit from it.
Well, I'm really thankful that you always make time for this show to come and speak with us here. And your approachable, lighthearted demeanor certainly makes all of this very entertaining and fun. So thank you so much for being with us.
I look forward to each and every other time. The next one is going to be firefighters. We're going to have firefighters go plant-based or stay usual diet.
Very cool. Okay. We got to get you on a flight.
Okay.
Thanks.
There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.